I've been looking at a whole bunch of DNS RFCs, learned some pretty interesting things, and I wanted to share them with you. Given the name of this talk, I'm sure some spooks have snuck in just to make sure that I'm not leaking any military secrets. Good. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. I'm Harrison. I'm a senior security consultant at CyberCX within the Adversary simulation team. If you ask people about me, they'll say one of three things. Firstly, who the hell is that guy? Secondly, he doesn't shut up about the DNS stuff. And thirdly, graphics design is his passion. DNS, the domain name system, don't let its simplicity fool you because there's a lot that goes into it. As you all know, good talks come in 3 parts. This one will be coming in 4. So we've got the history and current context of DNS in today's world. We're going to spoof federal government email. Then we're going to steal some of their data. We're going to have a look at DNSSEC and how it's potentially worse than having nothing at all. And then we're going to look at the future of DNS and what's to come. So before we do all that, we need some context on DNS, starting with its history. DNS was created in 1983 by a guy called Getty Images. It was intended for people to remember internet hosts by a human memorable name rather than its IP address. So instead of remembering that's not a valid IP, you can just remember the host name. But DNS is by no means new. Older protocols had name resolution baked in, like MBTNS and Anemone, Nemo joke. LNMNR, thank you, Microsoft, for your naming conventions, as always. But 99% of the time that you'll be using DNS, you'll be translating a hostname into an IP address. And this was certainly the author's intentions. But it's since been expanded to doing stuff like storing TXT records for proving domain ownership, or MX records for doing email routing, or DNS key records for signing DNSSEC signatures. There's also a fault-tolerant, globally distributed, web-scale, low latency database for storing jokes. Now, this is a DNS inside joke. I love inside jokes. I hope to be a part of one day. I also wanted to see what my personal Windows PC uses DNS for, so I pumped open Wireshark. And Microsoft must be doing updates over DNS now, because I saw a whole bunch of requests to this thing. Also, my computer's been really slow recently. I don't know why. Anywho. Now, DNS uses this whole recursive process for figuring out where to get your record from. But in doing so, you're trusting every single hop along the way. But you don't need to. You only need to trust the root zone or the DNS dot zone and work your way backwards. You can ask it about .com, and then the .com servers will be able to tell you about, say, your site was example.com, etc. You work your way down. But you can only ask the root zone about .com, .net, and all those TLDs we've known to come and love. So if you ask it about the .healthcare TLD, for instance, it'll tell you to piss off and ask some servers in the US, which is funny because if they can't be the authoritative provider of healthcare in practice, at least they can be the authoritative provider of healthcare in DNS. Now, enough sysadmin stuff. This is a security conference after all, so let's talk about ye olde CIA triad. Is it available? Yes, DNS in and of itself is pretty good. Can it be used to affect other systems availability? Absolutely. You may have heard of DNS amplification attacks. Sorry, DDoS, DNS amplification attacks. Man, that was a struggle. Is it confidential? No, it's unencrypted on the wire. Anyone can sniff it. Is it integral? Is that a word? Sure. No, again, it's plain text on the wire. Anyone can tamper with it, which is a concern because DNS is the root for identity on the internet. Every single online account you've ever made has been based in an email or a mobile number. Email, surprise, is rooted through DNS. Mobile numbers, a little bit more nuanced. The web server that you're creating the account on is going to be talking to some APIs to an SMS gateway, which again, based in DNS. Now, your enterprise or your web app can have security tools up the wazoo, but your users are only as secure as the bridge they use to travel to your zone. So me, as an adversary, I can print a 5-cent piece of paper and take users over to my very trustworthy, very secure island. I may not even need to hijack the bridge. I can hijack the island by waiting for your domain to expire and me to buy it up, or I can socially engineer your registrar into transferring your DNS zone over to me, which is why locking your domain is so important. Now, this is a big problem because people are trusting DNS with their medical records, their payment information. Put it this way, you can be typing your credit card information into ebay.com with a valid URL and a valid certificate and a padlock that's as green as the avocado my Victorian colleagues gluttonously slather on their toast every morning. It doesn't matter Because if I own DNS, I own your life. I own your credit card data, I own your online identity, and I own your health records. Now that's great, Harrison, but how often does DNS interception really happen? Well, every time you connect to free Wi-Fi, DNS is hijacked to redirect you to the login page. And I've even seen evidence of someone manually setting their DNS recursive resolver only for their ISP to hijack it. So who knows what the government is doing and making ISPs do and tracking your DNS connections. You ever seen this thing? Just so that we're all on the same page, that's the sun. I know in about July of this year, I forgot it existed after months and months of torrential rain. Thanks, Sydney. Do you know rockets, like space rockets, they often have multiple redundant computers. And that's not because they're running Windows and there's going to be an update that you can't stop when it comes time for landing, but because of cosmic radiation from the universe. They can flip bits in binary from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. So here's Windows.com in RAM white, right? Solar cosmic radiation from the sun hits it, and Windows is now Windows. So can't I just buy all the off by 1-bit domains and let the sun do its magic so that I can collect Microsoft credentials? Well, of course, there's nothing new under the sun. And a researcher already gave that a go. And they got traffic like this, where Windows was doing its time clock update to Microsoft servers. But can we take a couple of seconds to appreciate the magic of this? Cosmic radiation from the universe has hit RAM in the precise memory location for a bit to be translated to hit this adversarial domain just at the right time that this request was being made. Now, this is an NTP request, but imagine it's more of a Windows Microsoft account. You could probably catch credentials using that. So to recap, the IT security industry has done a really good job of securing user endpoints with EDR, OS hardening, etc. On the other end, we've done a really good job of securing enterprises and web applications with web application firewalls and SIEMs and everything. And then we rely on DNS, which is just a rickety bridge connecting the two, which has trolls underneath it, listening to traffic and diverting traffic and tampering with it. And on top of all that, you've got the hostility of the universe. And I hope that paints a picture as to the criticality of DNS and how vital it is to the internet and its security. So let's look at that a little bit more with spoofing government emails. Now, there's 3 email security measures that sit in DNS, and they work hand in hand to prevent email spoofing. The first is SPF, and no, I'm not talking about sunscreen. SPF dictates what IP address for a given domain can send email. So here, Cloudflare has dictated that these IP addresses are allowed to send email on its behalf. So if Gmail or Outlook gets an email from Cloudflare, it'll look up these records, cross-reference it. If it matches, it's likely come from a trusted source and it's sent to the inbox. If it doesn't match, it's likely been spoofed and it's sent to spam. The other thing with SPF is you can't just look at the root record. It's actually recursive. So yes, there are those IP addresses, but there are also IP addresses for, say, Salesforce.com. So I wrote a tool which recursively unpacks SPF records. So here, Cloudflare's, instead of just the root record, looks like all of this. If we have a look at Gmail's SPF record, it looks like this. And if we have a look at Hotmail, it looks like this. I'm sorry. DKIM brings public key cryptography to email. So much like on a legal document, you'll have someone writing a signature at the bottom to authentify it. DKIM is the same principle, just in a manner that's unforgeable with public key cryptography. Now, there's 3 parts to DKIM. There is the private key that sits on the email server. There is the public key sitting in DNS. And there is the signature in the SMTP headers of the email. So if data is tampered with in the email, the signature is no longer going to match based on the public key, and you can tell that it's been tampered with and it's discarded. But if the signature matches, it's likely been delivered safely and it's sent to users' inboxes. The problem with SPF and DKIM so far is that the RSCs were a little bit unclear as to what to do with email that didn't pass. So DMARC was proposed. It's called Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance, which is about the most boring sentence I've ever heard in my life. So DMARC is the go, no-go of email. It's the final decider. So here, Cloudflare says that any email that fails SPF or DKIM should be, well, rejected. And also there should be a report sent to all these domains. If you look at our authentication primitives, DKIM is something the mail server has. No, yes, something the mail server has, its private signing key, and SPF is something the email server is, its IP address, which would make DMARC the bouncer, that is the one that ultimately decides whether or not to let you in. Now, DMARC has a very complicated decision tree as to whether or not to send an email to the inbox, but it can be boiled down to these 5 cases. Now, you'll notice that you only need a good SPF or a good DKIM to pass DMARC, and if you pass DMARC, you're delivered to the user's inboxes. We don't care about the first one because we only need one or the other, and we don't care about the last one because we want to spoof the email and actually have it delivered. So, time for some actual real-world practical attacks based on these 3 ideas of having a misconfigured SPF, misconfigured DMARC, and misconfigured DKIM, starting with bad SPF. So that tool I wrote also cross-references every single IP range in the unrolled SPF record with all the IP ranges from public cloud providers. So Oracle, AWS, Azure, GCP, yada, yada. It'll cross-reference it. And if there's a match, it means I can obtain an IP address from within that range and spoof email for that domain. So I had a client that had this, and I used one of those cloud IP rotator scripts to get an IP address within the trusted range, which allowed me to send an email from it. And because it was from a trusted IP address, it was sent to the user's inbox. Which is why system administrators and security consultants need to seriously consider every single trusted IP range in that record. Otherwise, you've got an impersonation condition on your hands. Next up is bad DMARC. Now, I had a client that was one of the ASX 200 companies that had a DMARC policy that looked like this. Now, they're rejecting emails from their main domain, policy equals reject. But on subdomains, they said, don't worry about it. Subdomain policy equals none. So I picked an interesting subdomain to send emails from, and I made sure it didn't have an SPF record, which it didn't. It didn't even have an A record. Email doesn't care. You can pick whatever you want. So I sent an email from that subdomain. Because it was from a trusted DMARC location, it was sent to the victim's inbox. One wrong character in your DNS records can spell disastrous for an organization. Number 3, bad DKIM. This one actually required some brain power, unfortunately, because it really hurt. So the way this worked is that I had a grievance with one of the government departments. So in my own time, not on company time, for the record, I did what any sane person would do, and I hacked them. Legally, they had a responsible disclosure program. Don't worry about that. Now, I had an email from this government department in the past, and it looked a bit like this. And I noticed 2 misconfigurations. Can you spot them? Too late. L equals 4096 means only sign the first 4096 bytes of the email. I hope you can already see a problem with that. The second misconfiguration was these headers, and they weren't doing this thing called oversigning, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Because only the first 4096 bytes of the email are signed, I can tack on whatever adversarial content I want after that, and it will still be valid. Injecting custom headers is a little bit more nuanced. Here's a bit of theory for you. There's a mismatch between the SMTP RFC and the DKIM RFC. SMTP works from the top down. It'll find the first instance of a header, and it will interpret that. DKIM works from the bottom up, and the first header it sees in that direction, it will use for signing. So in other words, your Gmail, your Outlook, etc., is going to be interpreting that first header. That's what's displayed to the user. But DKIM is going to be signing on the final header. So we've got header injection and we've got content injection. So I was able to spoof email for a federal government department. Thank you. Except I wasn't, because you'll notice that Hi Harrison was in the first 4096 bytes. So I've just drastically reduced the range of people I can make victims of this misconfiguration. Until I went back to the original email, did some more thinking, and I realized, well, I can inject custom headers. Can't I tack on a new content type boundary and have the original content still skipped over? Now, it's still in the email source. The signature is still generated based off that. So DMARC passes and the email's delivered. Here's the final proof of concept: custom headers, custom content, and I was able to send arbitrary subjects to addresses, from addresses, dates, and content from this government department. If we dig into it, we can see that SPF fails because, surprise, I didn't have access to a government IP address. We would have bigger problems if I was able to do that. But because of the misconfigurations with the signature policy, I passed DKIM. And because you only need one of SPF or DKIM, DMARC passed and it was delivered. Is that organization department thanking me? They were so embarrassed that they didn't want me to call them by name, so I've had to redact them throughout the talk. Now, spoofed email is no joke. I've had colleagues try to brush me off because it's just a low or an informational wall. No. For a corporation, if you can spoof email, you can phish internal users, you can phish external users, you can tarnish their reputation by sending out some dodgy stuff, get them banned in IP reputation databases, and you can also spoof accounts billable and receivable to maybe make some money out of it. For the government, it's a lot worse. You can phish government employees, you can phish the public, you can threaten deportation and use that to extort someone to do whatever. You can request identity documents. And the last one's pretty major, given the current tension around the world. If I can send emails on behalf of the government, I'll let your mind go crazy. Alrighty, section number 3, DNSSEC. A traditional address lookup with regular DNS looks like that. You request it, you get your answers. DNSSEC, in long story short, has a signature that you can verify to make sure that those records weren't tampered with in transit. But in my opinion, DNSSEC is a misnomer. It's currently called Domain Name System Security. If it was renamed today, it'd probably be called DNS Auth for authentication or authenticity. Now, we're getting towards the end of the day. I can feel everyone's a bit groggy. So we're going to do some audience participation. So far, for the talks I've attended, people have only been asked to raise their hand or not. But no one has asked you to stand up and do 10 star jumps. Now, I'm not going to, but what I will do is we're going to say this together on 1. You ready? 3, 2, 1. DNSSEC does not encrypt records. Instead, the objective. Now that we're all a little bit more awake, there's actually one person left in this room that's still a little bit groggy. I can see him up the back. He's the cameraman, so I hope this gives you some exercise. Sorry. But I mean, there's a reason that Google uses DNSSEC and Facebook and banks and eBay use it, right? Well, here's some rapid fire reasons why organizations may choose not to use DNSSEC. Firstly, it uses cryptography from 20 years ago. It's pretty garbage. Only very, very recently did they approve elliptic curve cryptography. DNSSEC is government-controlled PKI. Now, the root of DNS is protected by a non-government organization. But guess who owns .com, .net, and 99% of the internet? And it's not like the US government has ever been known to sort of seize domains willy-nilly, have they? DNSSEC isn't seen by the user. We've done a great job with TLS, letting the end user know whether or not their connection is secured with TLS. But me as an end user, I have no idea whether the underlying DNS resolution was secured. DNSSEC has poor software support, and that might be because DNSSEC deployment is so minimal. Only 3% of .com domains use DNSSEC, which contributes to this chicken and the egg problem. No one uses DNSSEC because there's no software support for it, because no one uses DNSSEC, et cetera, et cetera. DNSSEC also means giving across your keys. If you want to delegate part of your zone, you can use NS records to give it to a third party, maybe a marketing department, to do stuff willy-nilly. But with DNSSEC, that means giving your zone signing keys over to them. Pretty dangerous. DNSSEC can also lead to creating a denial of service condition on yourself. If you implement it incorrectly, bad keys and signatures can be cached in DNS for weeks at a time. Pretty nasty. There have been some pretty major sites over the years that have gone down due to DNSSEC deployment failures. There have even been whole TLDs. If Cloudflare, who are in the business of DNS and DNSSEC, with hundreds of engineers can't get it right, what hope do our small and medium businesses here in Australia have? They can't even get TLS right. DNSSEC is also heavy. All those signatures contribute to massive answers, which can amplify those DDoS conditions we talked about earlier. Now, we can take a breather. Those are my arguments so far. And in a little bit, after my drink, we're going to go through the 2 final ones. The first is that DNSSEC doesn't protect the final mile. Okay, what does that mean? Does no one know? Because so here's a user asking for the A record of cloudflare.com. It recursively resolves and gets the answer back to them. So let's see what part of this process DNSSEC protects. The whole bit, right? Well, no, just this part. Which means I, as an adversary, as long as I'm sitting between the recursive resolver and the end user, can still tamper with traffic protected by DNSSEC. So the recursive resolver might be 1.1.1 or Google's 8.8.8.8.8. In most cases, for people in Australia, it will be their ISP's DNS server, or in an internal network, it might be their Active Directory controller. But again, there's like 5 to 10 different hops between those 2 points. And if I'm in the middle of any of them, DNSSEC means nothing to me. Even the RFC is like, well, that's not our problem, stuff you. So DNSSEC only really protects against BGP hijacks in core internet infrastructure. But if I'm in a position to do that, I'm going to be doing far more insidious things than just tampering with end user DNS traffic. All a man in the middle needs to do to tamper with DNSSEC traffic is toggle this single bit. So it's not even that complicated. This is a fun one. This is my favorite. I've done a lot of research into this. Do you remember from around 2004-ish, all the AXFR DNS zone transfer issues? Me personally, I didn't. I wasn't born yet. Well, they're back with DNSSEC. If you use DNSSEC, you have to use a protocol that I'm about to introduce. Now, DNS traditionally has 2 negative answers. There's NX domain if the name doesn't exist, and there's no data if the name exists, but not the record type you're looking up exists. What's this? Well, even if DNSSEC worked perfectly end-to-end, I, as a man in the middle, could still say NX domain, NX domain, NX domain, and still DOS them even if I can't tamper with the underlying records. Well, the DNSSEC authors thought about this and they said, we need some kind of measure to make sure that we can still sign null data. So we need to insert some kind of data that we can sign on negative records. So if I look this up, blockchain.stanford.edu, it doesn't exist, so I get an NX domain error. But this is gratuitously returned to me. So what does that mean? Well, DNSSEC is saying that there is nothing between blocky and blue Mac backup. So if you try and look up any name in between there, it's not going to exist. Not only that, but it tells me exactly what records are available for blocky. I don't even have to guess. You got your little InfoSec cogs in your brain going. If we can get adjacent names, can't we just linearly walk every single range? Well, yes, obviously, that's a rhetorical question. If we, again, look at Stanford and we look up non-existent domains iteratively, alphabetically, we get Blue Mac Backup, Blue MacBook 12, Blood Center, www.bloodcenter, et cetera, et cetera. But DNSSEC doesn't just work on domains and subdomains. It works on domains and TLDs. So here in the .mum zone, I can enumerate every single name. Your choice, your girlfriend, your boy, your dating. I didn't plan this. And I've got a little bit of an analogous point. DNS is great, and I've been talking about that. But as we all know, security conference, humans are the weakest link. And I'd just like to point that out in this presentation here, because there are 2 people in this room that shouldn't be. They snuck in, they socially engineered. I didn't know they had the heart to do it, but somehow my parents have sweet talked the organizers into being let in. Give everyone a wave. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Not only are they good social engineers, they're also good OSINTers, because I didn't tell them what time my talk was, so clearly they've looked it up online. You got a job when we get back, right? But you can't just enumerate subdomains and domains. You can actually go to the root DNS zone and enumerate TLDs. So you get AAA, ARP, ABAF, Abbott. If you continue, you'll get .com, .com.au, etc. I wrote a tool. Yeah, I did. I wrote a tool that does this for you automatically. You no longer need to use dig to look up every single range individually. But DNS people got together and they were like, this whole plain text range thing sounds like a terrible idea. So NSEC 3 was introduced. TLDR, it SHA-1 hashes the adjacent names, which is a step in the right direction, but it's not quite there. We can no longer linearly walk all the ranges, but we still get and can crawl the hash ranges, which is great because they're SHA-1 and Hashcat just go brrr. A white paper, very academic and boring. I'm going to speed over it, but I had a look at the prevalence of NSEC and NSEC3 records on the internet. TLDR, I managed to crack 44% of all NSEC3 domains on the internet. I appreciate fully that that doesn't sound impressive. You have www, you have blog, etc. They're very easily cracked. These, not so much. And for whatever reason, there's a whole bunch of junk in people's domains. Again, another thing to point out is PayPal, they were using NSEC, the plain text protocol, while I was doing my research. I wrapped up, went back to them, they've changed to NSEC3. I like to think that was me. I'm going to lay claim to that, but I thought that was pretty cool. So 44% is demonstrably more than you can get with your traditional methods, certificate transparency logs, brute forcing, etc. So not to shill my tool, but if you have an NSEC3 zone, you are better off running that than doing your traditional DNS brute forcing. Why should you care? Well, if I can enumerate your entire zone, I can find records you probably didn't intend to make public. For whatever reason, system administrators put sensitive records in a public database, hoping you're not going to find it. Well, you might find secret.admin.portal.example.com, for instance. Government agencies, beware. I told you those spooks are somewhere, I can smell them. If you can walk a .gov or .mil, you might find something spicy. And if a domain is, say, a software as a service provider, they might set up a subdomain for each of their clients. If I'm a competitor, I can probably crawl those and steal their clientele list. Cloudflare, bless their hearts, they were like, guys, NSEC3, terrible protocols. Can you see what you're introducing here? And they introduced an idea called DNSSEC blacklies, or otherwise called as minimally covering records. So rather than giving you the exact range, at runtime, it generates a response that's a very, very thin slither. So I looked up a non-existent domain between blog and whatever the next thing is, and all it returned to me was this /000. So it's still RFC compliant because it's giving me a range that there are no records within, but it's not actually disclosing the actual names in the zone, which is a great solution. What does the future of DNS and DNSSEC look like? Well, I don't know, I'm not a fortune teller, but I've had to guess. You may have seen DNS over TLS or DNS over HTTPS, where they work from the end user up rather than DNSSEC, which is the root zones down. Then there's DNS over Tor, but generally people like their web pages to load within 10 minutes. Then there's DNS Curve, which is DNSSEC just reimagined 20 years later, incorporating all of the failures into this new thing. Now, I've been all doom and gloom and FUD on DNSSEC. Some of you may ask, is it still worth implementing today? Is there any marginal benefit to it? I would heavily warn against implementing it yourself with bind or whatever. I'm not paid to say this, but in my research, Cloudflare were the only ones that addressed the security problems that I identified earlier. So should an organization implement DNSSEC in 2022? I think the answer is pretty clear, that you should do your own research and form your own opinion. To recap, we've had almost 200 slides in the last 30 minutes. We had a look at how DNS is the root of internet identity and security, which is fine because it's not like it's some rickety bridge connecting, two really secure islands next to each other. There's also trolls that may be listening and tampering with traffic. But even if that were the case, it is, but just for the narrative. DNSSEC is meant to prove that, right? Solve that, right? Well, no, not exactly. In fact, it can even make things worse with zone disclosures, DOS conditions. And finally, we had a look at how just a few little errors in your DNS records can lead to some pretty dire consequences. So security consultants and system administrators, I plead with you, because my colleagues won't listen, spare a thought for DNS. And also slap some sunscreen on your RAM to protect you from alien hackers from stealing your credentials with the power of the sun. Thank you.